Good morning, Grid Connections listeners. Welcome back to Season 6 of Grid Connections, the podcast where we explore all things transportation, clean energy, and our power grid, connecting all of these systems together. In this episode, we sit down with Mike Murphy, CEO of the EV Politics Project, to explore one of the biggest challenges facing EV adoption in the U.S. political polarization. With a background in Republican politics and a passion for the auto industry, Mike shares insights from EV politics research, including why traditional EV marketing is failing to reach even mainstream and conservative buyers alike, along with how the industry can shift its message to focus on attributes that truly resonate, like performance, energy independence, and American jobs. We also break down how China's dominance in the global auto market threatens U.S. automakers, the surprising ways dealership incentives are slowing EV adoption, and the real impact of EV tax credits on consumer purchasing decisions. Plus, we discuss why multifamily home charging is the biggest roadblock to wider EV adoption and the policies that could change that. If you're interested in the future of EVs and how policy, marketing, and public perception shape the industry, this is an episode you won't want to miss. Share it with someone who cares about the future of transportation, and don't forget to leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Also, be sure to sign up for our new newsletter. Just hit the link in the show notes to stay up to date on the latest in EVs, energy, and policy. Thanks for tuning in, and with that, enjoy.
Well, first of all, Chase, I'm a listener, and so it is great to be on your pod. I'm a big fan.
Long time listener, first time guest. Is that
First time blowhard here. So the story is, I'm a Republican. Well, in the Trump era, I'm one of these never Trumpers. So I don't know what my party idea is, but party ID. But I've been a Republican professionally for several decades, running campaigns all over the country. Schwarzenegger. A lot of governor races: Romney, Engler, Thompson, Jeb Bush in Florida, Christie Webb, blah, blah, blah. A couple of presidentials, worked for McCain in 2000. But I'm from Detroit. I grew up around the car business, and I'm a car nut. And I have to confess now, and don't turn off the pod, dear listeners, but my lifetime average is about 6 miles per gallon. But when I ran Schwarzenegger's campaign for governor, I moved to LA and I liked it, and I stayed. And as gas here went up to minibar levels, $7 a gallon, and I followed EV tech. And as a Republican, I kind of sneered at, geodesic dome mobiles. But the tech is too good to ignore. The physics are too clean and beautiful, really. So I got an EV and I loved it, and a BMW iX. And so that led to a huge amount of personal frustration at the knee-jerk reaction that Republican Party leaders and a lot of the rank and file have against EVs. They see them through a partisan lens. And as somebody who does follow the auto industry, I'm very worried about the great secret issue we don't talk about in American politics enough, which is China makes 3 times as many cars as we do. And we're on the path to British Leylandville with our domestic auto manufacturing if Chinese continue their kind of plan of conquest. They don't care about profits. They care about market share worldwide. So at the end of 23, I did what political consultants do. I called up a buddy of mine, a campaign pollster, Dr. David B. Hill, who was the first DeLorean owner I ever knew, and then the first Tesla owner, a car nut too, brilliant guy. And we did a poll at the end of 2023 that looked at the partisanship, the different views of EVs through the partisan, lens. We sampled in our survey 600 people nationally. They were voters, but with a family income of $50,000 a year up. And the reason we did that was we wanted to capture the entire, 90+% of the new and used car market. So we got about 2/3 of the voters in a presidential year in the sample. So we wouldn't try to predict an election with it, but gave us a very good idea for people's political identity against the car market. And I got it to the Automotive News, and the Economist wrote a big story about our findings. And then my phone started ringing from the OEM. So the CEO of one Detroit OEM, connected, and one thing led to another. So our initial mission was to share our data. We had some very strong findings with the car people to try to improve their marketing. And the little hint is, and, don't get mad at me if you're an environmental activist, but the environmental argument does not sell EVs. People who care a lot about climate change already like EVs. They're worried about charging range and price. People who think, and this is a lot of people in our fragmented, crazy American politics, who think that the whole climate change thing is kind of a scam, it's a trigger for them. And so the number on climate change is a big problem. We got to act now versus it's overhyped by the media and it's no big deal is about 58-40. And 58% big deal, act now, 40% bah humbug. So, and a lot of that correlates to partisanship. So the bottom line is when you put the green leaf on the car, I mean, that damn polar bear ad that they launched the Nissan Leaf with, it was clever advertising creative. It was terrible strategy because these things
And it
have
looked
been
expensive.
yeah,
Whoever they
yeah. I
hired
mean,
out for it,
it
that's
was
for
great
sure.
creative, but it
Yeah,
framed them
exactly.
as environmental virtue signaling mobiles, and that is still there, and it's a problem right now. Democrats buy EVs at 5 times the rate of Republicans. People may
Yeah.
say, "Great, who needs Republicans?" Well, the largest segment of the new car market is Republican. They're 40% of the buyers. Democrats are 36. So if you have a partisan fight over the vehicles, you're not going to sell anymore. Anyway, the companies that were into this were very into it because, as one CEO told me, we spent a lot of millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars on market research, but we basically ask people how many cup holders they want and how big their garage is. We never look at this partisan stuff, but that's the world we're in, and it is mushroomed with Trump. And
Yeah.
now most Republican voters, not all, thank God, but most are initially quite hostile to EVs. So we've done a lot of polling since then on how to crack that problem. The other thing we're trying to do is get the national EV debate moved over to American jobs, particularly vis-a-vis China's rise. A third of Republicans still think the USA is the world's number one auto producer. So, we're trying to help a lot right now defending the subsidies and some of the IRA programs that are under threat from the Biden administration. So we're busy, and we're at evpolitics.org or americanevjobs.org. You want to learn more about what we're doing.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. That's a great overview for what your team is doing, and I think what you just talked about really does highlight, I guess, two things. One, I've obviously been very involved with the electric vehicle kind of sphere for the last couple decades, but I also worked a lot on commercial solar installations.
Sure.
And the two big things, I mean, exactly, like pretty quickly, I'm pretty early on. I completely agree with you. In both those spaces, there is a small niche that is interested in the actual like green movement of it. The much larger interest is in kind of the TCO, total cost of operation, and the essentially the ability for it to be so low maintenance and create independence from
Right.
like having to go and whether that's commercially for like fleets who electrify and go with solar for charging to residential and personal use. I think that is such a big thing that you are talking about that just does not align with the messaging we've seen for so long and
Yeah.
with kind of the rise in tribalism among the different fractions of not only political parties but even brands of the vehicles. And I think when you had like the big three domestically that have leaned so heavily into like the big trucks and SUVs and now trying to position electrification, it really goes against the decades of marketing they've been even pushing forward themselves.
Well, yeah. And unfortunately, the ugly little secret is, the environmental movement, God bless them, and I believe in climate change, etc. But the market has never gone crazy for small cars in the US. And
Totally.
so now part of that is when gas is expensive, they have a boomlet. But generally, people gravitate to big suburban friendly SUVs or pickup trucks here. And, the chicken tax is part of that. It's a less competitive market. But so a great way to go out of business in the car world is to orient your company towards small vehicles. And,
Right.
there's niche room there. But the dream that we're going to talk everybody into driving European microcars in the US, you never want to market against culture. And I think one thing that went sideways with their early EV marketing is if you're in Japan, South Korea, Germany, Europe, there's more of a consensus on climate change. So if you're a European CEO and they come to you with, hey, here's the green leaf we're going to stamp on all the cars and we're going to talk about sustainability, this is great. Well, here we're divided. It's 58-40. And you
Right.
just, it's not that way in other countries, but they tend I've learned this doing campaigns abroad. The Whatever your culture is, you assume the local culture is similar. It's why
For
in
sure.
American foreign policy, we always fall in love with the first general we meet who can speak English and drink whiskey. We think, oh, that's our guy. He'll be the most
Right.
popular president of fill in the blank. Almost always ends badly. So it has been that here. Now, I do think, and we tell companies this, in your EV marketing, don't be afraid to remind people that the average family spends $2,000 a year on gas.
At
We ask
least, yeah.
Republicans and Democrats what they like about EVs. And the funny thing is, for all this partisan divide, they're pretty much the same. When we say less maintenance, they both love it. When we say gas and expense, they love it. Fast and fun to drive, they love it. Then when we say great for the environment, a 40-point difference breaks out. Then they're ready to fight, and the cars get caught in the middle. So sell the vehicle attributes. By the way, the best EV marketers in North America, they're not an auto company. They're the Polaris, the recreational vehicle folks. They make these. Uh, there's a categorical name for them, which I'm forgetting. But basically, you ride around the woods. They're a lot of fun. ATVs. They make an electric one called the Kinetic. You got to wait a year to get one. It is a huge seller. But they don't say, "Hey, Bubba, when you're out in the trees, protect Mother Nature." They say, "When you want stealth and
Yeah.
deadly, hunting ability, you can sneak up with our ultra quiet Kinetic." And they sell a lot of them. You got to go where the market is, or the market will kill you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it seems like we're going to be in complete agreement for this whole podcast. But I mean, around exactly what you're talking about, like with where the kind of idea of EVs for the longest time were just electric golf carts. And I know we'll probably get into this anyway because of some of the recent polling you did, but it was really Tesla. And they were the ones to kind of re-change that conversation. It's like,
Yep.
if you want to save the planet, we can do that. But we make a really good looking car that's really fast, that meets your needs, that you can charge at home and gives you independence. And hey, here's a battery and solar to go completely off, gives you the full platform.
Right.
And I think right now, all the politics aside around Elon Musk and that stuff, it is just like getting caught up in the wrong things. And I still am convinced, like pretty much daily, that this is a smaller portion of actual Americans and just kind of the narrative that gets caught up versus like the reality of the car buying and like shopping market of what they're actually looking for and what they want in a vehicle. And
Yeah,
to
no,
really,
it's all attributes. I mean, that, the theoretically, if you only wanted transportation, there'd be one model car,
right.
and it would be one color. But people like to express themselves through their cars. Half of automotive marketing is built on that premise. Why we have so many different kinds of car, and so attributes is the focal point, plus price and
Yeah,
quality and word of mouth. And we've learned a lot about how to get the word out on EVs. The best is peer to peer. In all our polls, we ask people, do you have friends or family own an EV? Yes or no? Among the people who say yes, they rate EVs higher in every category.
yeah,
I don't care if they're Republican, Democrat, communist, whatever they are. They're going to give, if they know somebody in their life who has an EV, they're going to be warmer on it. If they don't, they're going to be more hostile. And so I tell the companies, pump some inventory into dealer loaner fleets, by the way,
for sure.
and give them to people for a weekend. Burn up a bunch of miles. You have an unsellable car at the end, but I would cut regular marketing spend, television, digital, everything else, at a rate 4 to 1. In other words, I cut $4 of that to fund this program, and you get a higher ROI.
Yeah,
And
it's
then charging. I give Ford big props. They finally figured it out that you handle the level 2 charger in the garage problem. You be the one source. And that's given them a big sales bump because
for sure.
this is one of my favorite. I'm going to rant for 1 minute and then you can
Do
get
it.
me back on track. One of the biggest problems in the current system, and we're studying this, and this is something we want to do some work on. If you're a retail car salesman, and anybody who's bought or leased a car in a dealership will remember this. What's the last thing you hear when you buy or lease a car? Call me if you need anything. Now you're going to get a letter or an email
I was
or
gonna
a
say it's
call.
usually, do you want the undercoating? Do you
Well, yeah,
want
that's
yeah,
F&I.
yeah,
They're going to upgrade
yeah.
you. How
Yeah,
about a
yeah,
low
yeah.
jack, or the
Exactly.
special
But I'm
magic
sorry,
aluminum
continue the
foil?
rant. I
No,
yeah.
no, no. But what the salesperson is, before they turn you over to F&I, or when they deliver the car after, you do all the F&I stuff, they're going to say, you're going to be hearing from the dealer. Please give me a high rating. It's
Yeah,
really important, a high rating. Look out for that thing. It really helps me. And call me if you need any, blah, 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 blah. Because their comp is to varying degrees tied to that rating. So let's say you're in a Chevy store somewhere. Guy comes in, wants a Silverado, complains about the gas mileage. Now, if you're just trying to move a unit, we got these electrics here. It'll save you $2,000 a year if you're a one-car family. Why don't we take them for a test drive? You won't believe the acceleration, and you're never going to see a transmission shop again. But what the retail salesperson is thinking is, I'm going to put them into this electric, and they're going to take a few weeks to figure out the garage charging because they don't know an electrician, or they don't want to spend the grand because the down payment took all their, whatever it is. And they're going to wind up at a Walmart, particularly if you're in a big metroplex. And they're going to be waiting for Uber drivers to charge. And they're going to get pissed. And then my comp letter is going to show up,
right.
and they're going to ding me, and it's going to cost me a third of my commission. I'm not going to take that risk. So outside of the Ford world, we are incentivizing salespeople, even with the spiffs they give them for moving in electric, which some do, to take a risk on the charging problem. So, or push them in. Well, I hear gas prices are going down, where things are getting better, and just don't be heavy on the pedal, and put them into the ICE car.
Yeah,
So on the showroom floor, we have negative incentives right now. And again, kudos to Ford, and we work with Ford. They're great for fixing that problem. And hopefully the others will copy it, because they will sell more EVs. And it's not that hard to have that system in place. You just have to have a good vendor who can drop in, a
for
charger.
sure.
Most utilities will pay for the box.
Yeah, so this is such a weird dynamic, and once again, incomplete agreement. But
We'll find
here's,
something to disagree with.
hopefully, yeah. Otherwise, this might be a boring podcast. But no, no, seriously though, the amount, like the one thing, this just being around EVs for the last decade, a lot of like the nonprofits and other people always say, well, you just need to get butts in seats. You need to get butts in seats.
Right.
And I think about 5 years ago, that conversation changed, and people are like, that's no longer effective. But you're totally right that like peer-to-peer conversation
Oh, it's
is
everything.
still the biggest thing. And I think obviously this kind of goes to the tribalism I was talking about, but even now with EVs, I mean, what's so fascinating was I was looking at kind of other options for EVs on the market for kind of doing some essentially intelligence gathering for like some dealerships and looking at this. And the area where the startups have been so successful is they've leaned even more into like, not just here's the keys, drive for whatever, but you're right. They'll like, here, you can have it for a weekend.
Yeah, you got to have a longer drive, and you've got to have the other thing. And there's a VW store that Elena Ciccatelli had on her podcast, and I want to make a little film about that for one of our programs. Guy put all his sales force into EVs, whether they wanted to or not. Had a revolt,
Yeah,
the
that's a
sales
great
manager,
one too.
for a week, and then half of them became fanatics. And guess what? Look at the Lyft, even selling ID4s at the Lyft they had. So it's a fixable problem. The other part of it people don't talk about, but if you own an auto store in, say, Kansas City, where you're not in a big, well, any urban market is decent for EVs generally, but it's not San Francisco or Dallas or LA.
Right.
And you own the dealership, they roll in and say, well, you're not going to make as much service money, which is, of course, fixed ops are a huge profit thing for most dealers. You got to put in heavier hoists to lift these big, heavy EVs, particularly the pickup trucks and that kind of thing, or God forbid that Hummer. Even though I kind of like that vehicle. I fantasize about getting one in LA just to bum people out.
The
But
lease rates for them are so cheap right now, which
no,
is
no,
so
I'm in
funny.
love with it. I think it's great. And
Yeah,
kudos for GM. Look, if we're going to make an EV Hummer, make an EV Hummer.
exactly. It is the Hummer of EVs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I give GM a salute there. But anyway, you got to put in the heavy lift. And by the way, you need a forklift to replace batteries. And because you lose your fire insurance for the whole dealership. So you got to build a blockhouse out back in most places to store the extra batteries. So a lot of costs for very little return on the fixed op side. And the average dealer is like, God, why do I need that headache? And by the way, I'm in a red state where people think these are Biden mobiles and they resent them. So no. So the retail part of it is clogged up. It's retail
Yeah.
multifamily charging, level two charge are the two biggest problems. I'm not as worried about an EV. I've driven an ID4 across the country 3 times in the last 18 months from LA to Boston. No problems at all on the highway. It's much, the first time it was bumpy with Electrify America, much better now.
Yeah, it's
But
wild. Not only just Electrify America, but just so many other. I mean, more
yeah,
of the traditional fueling and travel centers like the Pilots and Loves and Flying
right,
J's of the world's
exactly.
kind of coming out. It is,
Bucky's, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Bucky's is a great one too. It is really interesting to me. As someone who's also done a lot of EV road trips, it's wild to see. Obviously, you've got like I-5 and some of these like corridor things on the West Coast, but heading east, I-84 there. And if you look at a map of like EV charging station, there is a big gap. It's getting a lot better, but like just west of the Missouri River until you hit like some of the like I-5 west, like
Yeah,
there's
no,
some
no,
pretty
you're
decent
on that
gaps.
Colorado pipeline there because God forbid
Exactly.
you turn into Montana, then you're
Yeah,
going to
yeah,
be
yeah.
selling your car for parts and walking home. But all
But
that, I mean, we can talk about an EV and the political problems and everything else, but fundamentally, and we ask people this on our polling, you have a lot, particularly in a big multiplex, you have a lot of people who can afford a 60 grand EV in a million five, million six, million eight condo who can't have level two charging. And
right,
they want EVs and they won't buy them for that reason. It is a huge problem. Then on the other end, you've got a lot of rideshare drivers who would much rather charge overnight at home at 19 cents a kilowatt. It would be a meaningful pay raise to them. We're doing a lot of work on this because I mean, one of the largest developers in the country for communities. We're close to them, and they're looking at this, and because they know it's an attribute people want, it's just the capex scares them away. Because in the real estate business,
for sure.
your capex should be in maintenance to keep the stuff out, and every other dollar comes right out of your profit. And
Yeah,
the other problem with multifamily is there's so many owners, so many families who have 3 or 4 buildings they pass down. You can't make 3 phone calls and well, the multifamily people are on board.
right.
You got to go find 30,000 different owners and talk them into it, which means it has to be free, by the way.
Yeah,
It's very hard to do the pitch. This will only cost you $250,000, and in
yeah.
11 years you'll make the money back.
I want to share one more anecdote that kind of
Yeah,
will
yeah.
lead us to this multifamily thing that I recently just had yesterday. I've started working with, I need to look up their name again, but essentially it's called I think the Y East Rural Driving Program. And essentially what it is, it's focused mostly on like which is a very rural part of the country, Eastern Oregon, and parts of the Northwest. But they were talking about kind of exactly what you're talking about. This guy, he's always been a big Chevy Silverado guy, but his wife works at home and they live in Antelope, Oregon.
Right.
Some people listening to this will know where that is. If you are an Oregonian, a lot don't know where that is. The best and unfortunately best way to know where it is if you've seen the documentary Wild Wild Country. That is
Mhm.
the famous Rajneeshi kind of cult, and
Right,
it's
right.
that for a reason because it's
That's the
so
Bagua,
remote.
right? Right, the
Yeah,
purple
yeah,
Rolls Royces, not
yeah,
electric, right?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. And every now and then, if you watch on any of like the car bidding things, you'll still see them pop up. But that's a whole nother podcast. Either way, it's a very rural part of Oregon. They had a Chevy Silverado that they kind of use for everything. The wife works at home as an accountant, but she has to drive every morning about 25 miles, the kids to not to school, but to the bus stop, which
Wow.
is wild. And so she's driving about roughly about almost when they figured it out, close to 70 miles a day. And in that Silverado with the gas and everything, they're like, I don't know if we want to get EV, but there's a pretty big financial incentive to do it. And it's exactly this. And they're like, I don't know if it makes sense. The Tesla dealership in Central Oregon and Bend offered them to have it for the weekend. They had it for the weekend. And before they even returned to the dealership, they said they'd lease it. They're like,
Oh, yeah.
we're sold.
Well,
And
once
this
they
this
get the
goes back
level
to
2 thing working, you
well,
get your
that's the thing. They didn't even
250,
have
300
that.
miles, then
Just
they're
having
fine.
just having level one was
Yeah.
like, okay, we
Wow.
can make this work.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it's a stretch, but like we can
yeah.
see how this works. And you're totally right. And I like to put the idea in their heads like, obviously it's not the fastest, but even to me as an EV driver, it's still insane that the same outlet I plug my electric toothbrush in, I can plug my car in
Right,
and do
right.
most of my daily driving. And I drive 25 to 30,000 miles a year. And so like seeing how this evolution is happening, but this gets to what you're talking about. It's like going into multifamily homes. Not only do you have to have this different mindset approach to the residential or to the tenants, to the actual consumer of why to get EVs and how it fits in their life. And I think this actually goes really well to that recent podcast you had with Tom Malogny on your Directly
Mhm.
Current podcast, kind of talking about how important level 1, level 2 is. But then getting into that multifamily side of it, it's like, okay, the consumers are now bought in. They can make it work with level 1, level 2 charging. How do you actually get this to them if they
Right.
don't own the property, own the home? And that's kind of the next big hurdle. But it's
Well,
clearly, it's not a lack of technology. The technology was the batteries and the EVs, and we've kind of figured that out.
and
It's
it's
the
getting better
actual,
quickly. I mean, we've got
exactly,
your own Moore's law going on of batteries. So God,
exactly.
in 5 years, this is hope they're not all Chinese. I mean, we're in an interesting moment here in LA, and it's true in the other big cities. But LA County is probably the biggest EV market in America. I would think it's 10 million people with about a 25% EV, sales rate. So it's nightmare to fast charge here.
Yeah,
For two reasons. One is all the stations are overcrowded because there aren't enough stations. And two, it's near impossible to commission a fast charging station. I'm obsessed.
it's a
There's an
perfect
EV
storm.
Go station on, if you're an LA person listening, it's on Robertson Boulevard right by the 10 freeway. 10 freeway is a great interstate because you can literally swim out of the water in your swimsuit in Santa Monica,
Right.
get on the 10 and drive all the way to Jacksonville and then jump in the other ocean. I'm sure the planet will stop turning at that point, but it's ocean to ocean. So it's a very important highway across Los Angeles. And 2 years ago, EV Go next to a Shell station got a big lot. And God bless them, they built the most beautiful EV Go station I've ever seen. Everything but a canopy. It's got like 10 dispensers
Wow.
and a construction fence, portable fencing around it. And I've watched it for 2 years. It got to the point where it looked like a set for The Walking Dead. The weeds were taller than the chargers. They were growing up next to I took some pictures of it and sent
Yeah.
them to EVgo and I said, you guys, God forbid Fox News finds this thing because it's the perfect Navy screw up, even if it's
Yeah.
not Navy. By the way, California, we have not built an EV station here yet. Don't even get me started. We have to look to Republican run Ohio on how to do it right, or New York.
Right. Right.
Anyway, so they finally cut the weeds. I went nuts about this and just kept pestering them. It took me a year, and suddenly the weeds vanished, but it still hasn't been commissioned. And I can't really get them to explain it to me, but I'm sure, knowing LA and having complained to the governor's world about this, there are 22 different authorities, which is why in the urban fast charging, I am a huge fan of the battery backup. I love the
Yeah.
Electric Era guys, and I love ADS Tech. They're kind of the two leaders, a Chinese company too, X-Charge, I think it's called, something like that. But Electric Era has a lot of advantages because they're purely software based, so their functionality is higher than
Yeah,
anybody else.
they're a great team. We've had them on before,
Yeah,
and
those
as
guys are
someone
good.
who's
I'm
used their
looking at building
chargers,
a
I'm a big
station with
fan.
them in Malibu. I'm trying hard to get it
That's
done.
great.
And ADS Tech, I'm going to see who can solve it
If you do get it
cheaper.
open, let me know. I'll drive down. That'd
Yeah,
be awesome.
yeah. Well, we've got a good location, though. I got to convince the owner to do it, and but even them with their lower demands and faster commissioning, the Malibu regulations. And anyway, I can bore you to death. I've tried twice. I tried to build an EV station in Concord, New Hampshire, near the state capitol, because I wanted to get a tourism subsidy to localize some battery-based chargers. Couldn't get off first base. The
Hmm.
DV corridor apparently didn't believe in the Lakes region, and I have a friend who has to tow his Lucid all the time coming up from Boston. There's no fast charging
Jeez.
up there, except Tesla. So anyway, I'm unhappy with what Trump is doing with Navy, but I'm a critic of a lot of the program
Yeah.
because they gave a lot of wet spaghetti to the states to push uphill, and the states have not been particularly good at it. Some have. Some have been great. Ohio, Mike DeWine. It's kind of funny. An old school meat and potatoes Republican governor has been arguably the best job. But for the most part, here in EV Paradise, California, it's been a mess. And, other red states now are taking a cue from the Trump administration, which is going to create, I can just see some publicity hound Republican governors saying, I'm taking all my liberal Biden electric car money and I'm going to send it back to the president to hire more immigration agents to deport them illegals. I mean,
Or
and
build oil wells. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah. And, what people, I've been saying this for 2 years, they're like, well, it's appropriated by Congress. Again, that's all true. But bureaucracies are pretty lousy at doing stuff even when they're trying to help. Uh, in the Trump world, they're going to leave jobs open, and nobody's going to answer the phone.
For
And
sure. No, I
so
mean,
getting
this
your
is
paperwork
exactly,
through, it's like
yeah.
passive resistance.
No, this is exactly what we were talking with Lauren McDonald a couple episodes
Sure.
back about kind of the NEVI funds and how now that Trump's in, it's really become the blue state, red state kind of divide as to how these funds move forward. Which,
Right.
I mean, there was already a bit of that with some of the states that just said we're not even going to deal with this. But I think that's a really interesting kind of dynamic about like, I mean, in some ways, I'm more continuously confirmed by the idea that the path to hell is paved with good intentions,
Yeah.
where it's just like, that's a great intention, but the execution, the time, and all these other things. And I think there's definitely a place for it to show kind of like what this technology can be, what it can do. And it had a really good point of trying to cover some of these places that are more rural
Right.
that some of the other larger providers hadn't either had the financial incentive or just weren't ready to cover. And so this kind of helps fill those gaps to make EV charging and driving a lot more feasible. But I think going back to your point on like the focus on multifamily and kind of some of the things that, once again, there are obviously some kind of like city, state, county incentives for that. But I think in a lot of ways, the beauty of that over DC fast charging, especially in the LA area, where like you're talking about, not only sometimes you have the rundown issues, but you also have another thing Lauren brought up was EVgo even said 25% of their
Ride
drivers
share.
charging are rideshare.
Yep.
And I think there does need to be kind of how there is already commercial fueling for taxis and all these other things. There needs to be like a commercial charging element, but you can
Well,
bypass a lot of that by putting in place the ability for like multifamily and that level one and charging at home for these
yeah,
drivers that
we're,
depend on
we're
the
we're
job.
doing a lot of work on this, and so we haven't really gone public with it. So I'm going to be a little guarded here, but it is a
We'll
fact.
have to have you back on then when it
Yeah,
goes
yeah,
public.
that if you're a full time rideshare driver and you're in an EV because you got a subsidized lease, you live in an apartment. Not all, but majority. So you have a targetable group there that ought to have overnight level two charging, and that'll put another $500 a month or more into their paycheck just in savings. Now, some of them for the first year of the vehicle are surfing on the free charging thing, but that will go away, and then they're paying 55 cents a kilowatt versus 19 or less at home if they night charge. So there's a wonderful solution here that is gaining some traction in the public policy world, and we're pushing this because we can make a meaningful difference to them, to emissions, to adoption, and we can cut that line at the CCS charger at the Walmart. So I think in the metroplexes, nothing is more important than level two and multifamily. And on the other end of the scale, in the condominium world,
Yeah.
I mean, one reason we're looking at this charger in Malibu is there are a lot of very expensive condos around and big adoption of EVs, but those condo associations are still pretty tricky to install level two. I mean, I've done it. This office I'm doing this in is a former apartment building. There are still some apartment tenants here. I'm in this thing, and luckily I knew the owner, so I said, "Hey, what about putting EV charging in?" Hell no, complicated. I say, "No, no, just let me call your electrician. I'll pay for it." He said, "Oh, all right. Show me it when it's done." So I put it in here. It wasn't cheap, but I've
Yeah.
got a charger downstairs. Now the other tenants come by and say, "Hey, how do you get one of those?" So the demand is definitely there, but you've got to make it very easy for the multifamily uh, ownership, who I can tell you are not going to spend a dime. You can
Right.
say, "Oh, you get a tax incentive, you get a paper crown, you get this." No, no, no. What they want to do is charge people a little bit more for having it. And they want people to pay their own bill, which is doable because these things have their own power meters. But
Yeah.
somebody else has to come in and spend the capex. The good news is it's not that expensive. You can do it for, depending on whether you use union electricians or not, which any political deal in
Right.
the blue state means, but 7, 8 grand of parking space. Maybe,
Eh,
people argue you can do it for even less. You kind of can, but there are issues with power in the buildings and everything. So I'll shoot a little high. But for infrastructure spending, say 6,000 a parking space, not that bad
Yeah. And
compared to what a $2 million fast charging station costs, and it'll take you
for
3 years.
sure. Exactly. And I'm kind of curious. You alluded to maybe it's too early to share all this. So maybe we'll have to have this conversation
Yeah,
on the next
sure.
podcast. But For those listening, is there anything you'd recommend that they do or reach out to local politicians, or what can they do to help make this easier for either themselves or their neighbors and others?
Well, they right now, the best way to do this is to move some of the Gen 2 Navy money this direction, and to get some state money for it. And there is in a blue state a pretty good political deal where you can say, hey, governor, sitting in a room next door, I have the electricians union, building trades. I've got the environmentalists. I've got the apartment owners, as long as they can charge $20 a month, love this and keep all the money. And I have some of the wage advocates who would like rideshare drivers to make more money. Ideally, they'd want to unionize them, which is a killer for the companies. They're never going to go
Yeah,
for that. It kills their economic model. So we got a pretty good constituency here. Let's find 100 million in the state budget or do a bond. And guess what? We can go do 50,000 apartment building spaces, or maybe 100,000. So red states, it'll be a heavy lift. Maybe you can do it in a municipality in a red state. But
hmm,
I mean, if we get it done in California, everything that happens in America happens first here. It'll catch fire. So a lot of work is being done on this. So stand by. And in the meantime, when you send your rent every month, put a slip in, please, we need level 2 EV charging, Mr. Landlord, and I pay a little more to get it, which is a language they understand. The love language of landlords is, how do I get more money beyond what I can increase based on rent control or whatever? Because
exactly.
think about it, you're a landlord, you got an apartment building, and you're allowed to charge $25 a month if you have an EV friendly parking space. Most EV, if it's 200 a month, they won't pay. $25 they'll probably pay. So you get, let's say, 10 spaces, that's $250 across 10, times a year, you're looking at $3,000 or $4,000 times 10's year, 30 or 40,000 bucks at no cost to you. So that gets them interested enough to like let the electricians in the building to drop in this
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly.
So anyway, we're working on, and we're trying to raise some grant money. We do take donations, and our C3 is tax deductible, to put a coalition together to try to get this done in a big blue state.
Well, that's great. And I guess for
That's a
anyone
model.
listening, we will have like usually, we will have the links to your program and everything else in
Sure.
today's show notes. So for anyone listening that's curious, please check that out to do more of it. I think,
And I will say the rideshare companies are hep to this.
yeah,
I don't want to mention names and stuff, but we started shopping the idea around, and there is some interest. So it'll take a
that's
while, but
great.
here in California, I mean, I'll say to his credit, Newsom is pro EV. But the hardest thing when you're governor of California is dealing with the municipalities. Again, why is there the most beautiful EV? And if you go to evpolitics.org on the blog, I have some pictures of it during the Walking Dead phase. But it's still not commissioned. And
Yeah.
we have multiple jurisdictions here. I mean, it's just crazy. California is the reason, by the way, that in Navy, the machines have to have credit card readers, which are hugely failure prone. Although I think the
Right.
electric era guys have cracked that problem in some ways.
Well, they've actually been really impressive of doing quick installations in California.
Oh yeah,
They
they're the
shared some
only
of their
game in
secrets, but
town.
I
Yeah,
pushed them to share more, and
yeah.
clearly there's a little bit of their own
Well, you don't need to
secret
order
sauce in it. But
a big transformer. You need to
exactly,
wait a
that's a
year and
great
a half
point.
for it
Yeah,
because they use existing power and they buttress it with a battery. They charge you. ADS Tech. I should speak up for them a little too. I was over selling our wares here in Germany. I met with the CEO of Mercedes-Benz, the global CEO, great guy, Ulla Kallenhaus,
yeah,
and totally pro EV. And I was asking about charging. He goes, you got to look at these ADS Tech guys. They do a battery-based thing. We're putting one on the front lawn of our Mercedes World headquarters. So I talked to their CEO, and they've opened a U.S. operation.
that's
And their
great.
first job was they put 90 of these battery back things in Porsche dealers all over. They got the Porsche contract. You will see them. It's kind of a weird gooseneck, very thin
Yeah,
dispenser, and then a
yeah,
big box. I think it's called the Magic Box or something. It's very similar to Electric Era. Electric Era would say our software is better because we don't do modules, and let them fight that out. They're both friends of mine. And in the real world, I'm looking at both for Malibu. But that is a great way. Like, let's say you're in a suburban little shopping area and you can't put in a big EV Go or Electrify America or even a Tesla station. You can drop in a battery backed ADS Tech or electric era, and take up 3 parking spaces, not 12, and you can tie into existing power or get a slight service upgrade. It all works so much quicker. So having a lot of those, in my view, is better than building the massive stations in the urbanized stuff. Massive stuff works great on the highway in a big deal. Now in secondary highways, that's where electric air is done well in Northern California, because those battery back things can't do as many charges a day,
Right.
but they can do plenty, and there's a better margin for the owner, by the way. The biggest look at EVgo's books. They're a public company. It's heartbreaking. It's very hard for them to make any money because of demand charges. So they'd sell you $21 worth of electricity and they make $1.
Yeah.
And those stations are expensive. So, I worry about that business model. On the other hand, if you're battery buffered, like to build an electric era station with 3 dispensers and 6 nozzles will cost you $600,000 to $800,000. You can probably do it in 6 months. I mean, I'm using some of the numbers I'm looking at. It's not a moneymaker. You're not going to get rich, but you're not going to get killed doing it. You might make a little money. And if you've got an amenity there, if you're the local mall owner and you've got a Starbucks and a Subway or whatever, or convenience store, it starts to add up. It becomes people have 20 minutes to kill, go buy a Subway or Starbucks or whatever. So
I think this is something
model.
we've definitely talked about a lot, is like the DC fast charging business model for a lot of the chargers is it's hard business. We'll leave it at that. But I mean, look at what the traditional gas infrastructure is. Like, they don't make money selling gas to gas cars. They make money when you come and buy that hot dog.
That's all the margin is, the potato chips. Same deal.
Exactly. The chips, the gum, whatever. It's like you go into the store. And so there is obviously kind of that CapEx expenditure to put this in. But that, I think, is why you're going to see more of the traditional fueling stations and, like you said, malls and other places where there's kind of the delta in charging is coming down anyway. But there's
Right.
places where it makes sense that if you have to go to the Safeway or somewhere and shop anyway once a week for 30 minutes, like, it's perfect for doing that. If you have to fast charge and you can't charge at home, it's like, it's these kinds of things that make sense in the short to medium term, but also make a lot of sense long term.
Yeah, my friend Carl, who's at the Transportation Electrification Institute, I think it is, had me speak to their big meeting in Minneapolis. And there's kind of a myth in the EV world of the oil companies are out to kill us and everything. And some of them are, but some aren't. And I had a bunch of big oil guys, talk to me after the presentation, and they were like, "Hey, we would love to hold people for 17 minutes at one of our stations and sell them 3 times as many Pringles at a 40% margin. Are you kidding? It's a gold mine. That's why we're here. The problem is the utilities charge us $2 million to bring the power in, and we're never going to make it back." So, that's the battery buffered thing. I go into my pitch on that, but the power infrastructure thing is an issue. It's funny. Pete Buttigieg, when he was transportation secretary, was a big backer of ours, and I would meet with him and give him the data, and he was all in. And I kept saying, I wish you guys could all take Republican pills, because instead of giving money to the states to add 7 layers of their own, well, it's got to be installed by left-handed, people who are also poets, and just all the crazy neighborhood targeting.
Yeah.
Offer charge point operators 5 years of very cheap power. So you go to the power companies and say, "Hey, power companies, here's a lot of government money. It's worth building infrastructure. You're going to get paid for the next 7 years on a sliding scale. And if I build a charging station and I get my reliability over 95% or, a reasonable number, I get that cheap power for 5, 6, 7 years, then I'm weaned off it and I can make a profit." They will figure out what charging equipment to buy, where to put the station. And it would be like if I wanted to get American needed 10,000 new bars, I would say, "Hey, if you're a bar owner and you don't have a criminal record and you don't serve minors, I will give you free beer for 5 years. You figure the rest out."
Yeah.
And they would. And as you wean them off, some would fail, but they would know to be in the long term, they got to get it right and it would all work. And that way the government's only writing one check, to one fund, rather than all this micromanaging at multiple levels we have now, which is why I think I heard some of the estimates on your pod. I think because of slow walking stuff, I'm not even optimistic we're going to get to this, 800 that are due. I think it might be
Yeah.
600 or 700 because of red state bureaucrats trying to slow walk everything,
No,
which
I
is
think
tragic.
that's a good call, and maybe this would be a good point to bring up my recent experience on the state level.
Yeah.
And I think we've talked a lot, obviously, on the federal. I'm kind of curious to hear more, especially for our listeners, ways they can help on the state level, because I live now in Washington, state of Washington, clarify,
Hmm.
and it's the only state on the West Coast where you have to still have the dealership model. Tesla got kind of
Yeah,
like
it's a
a
nightmare to
carve
buy a
out.
Rivian there. Tesla
Right,
has
right, right.
been they have
Tesla
a
had this
carve
carve
out
out
'cause in
back
the
in
early days.
2014. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
well,
back
the
then
auto
everyone's like,
dealers all thought the Tesla was like a golf cart. Who cares? Let the kid have his stupid direct sales.
exactly.
But now, and I've seen some polling on this, that it's massively unpopular. People really want the right to buy at a dealership or to buy direct. So this is the kind of thing, if it ever got on a ballot initiative, I think for once the dealers might actually get beat in a locality, because normally they're very strong on the ground. They're very strong in state capitals, which is why the bill
Yes.
lost last year. But
Well,
if you ever took it to the people, I think it would pass.
I completely agree. And I was up in Olympia, it's been a couple, I guess 2 weeks ago now, trying meeting with legislators and talking with people about this. And it's so fascinating to me because when I talk to people about this, completely agree with you. They're like, oh yeah, this makes sense. This should just be legal. Why is this another hurdle? And then the next question I ask them is like, who do you think's pushing against it? And they're like, oh, I bet you it's the Republicans and all this. And to be honest with you, there was like a little bit of pushback I got from Republicans just because a lot of them, especially the more rural ones, did have car dealerships in their areas that employ people.
Yeah,
And they also do support the Little League and all these sorts of things. Having said that, they would mention that, but the conversations I would have with them were much more open. And ironically, as we would say, it's like, yes, we're pro-choice. We want to have
right.
more businesses and more things. And it started to go down a completely different political path. But actually, most of the Republican legislators were totally open to it.
Yeah. No,
And
competition is good. And by the way, the quote unquote dealers still have service. They can sell used
exactly.
cars. Good for everyone.
And
Hannah Steinway?
yeah, I
Yeah,
haven't met her personally, but I'm familiar with her work.
she's very deep in this issue on Rivian's behalf there, because it's a state they'd very much like to be able to direct sale in.
For sure. And I mean, they were even sharing that they believe their sales would triple if they, in the state of Washington, if
Yeah.
they were able to do this. But it was interesting because then I was talking to some of the Democrat legislators, and to be honest with you, it wasn't bad conversations. They were open to it, but the big thing were like kind of getting into these stipulations, like, well, what about the jobs? This? What about this? What about like getting into some of these like more nitty gritty? Like, are those good things? Yes, but I think it'd be a net benefit to everyone just to have EV options.
Yeah.
And so there's elements where I have to kind of be patient, educate, bite my tongue every now
Yeah,
here
and
and
I'll tell
there.
you, the way state
But
legislative politics work is they're like, well, we're open to it. Tell us more. And then at midnight, they kill it because they're afraid of the dealers.
totally. And it
You
was
know,
also clear with just this round of the legislature being open. We had like a 6 minute gap between the 30 other people that were meeting with them that
yeah,
day
yeah.
and trying to
No,
get
they're
to it.
just trying
And
to survive the meeting. They probably like to
yeah,
do it, but the real politics are in most state legislatures, you don't want to fight the dealers. They're too
right.
tough.
Well,
So
and
that's
then
why
the
you have to
other,
go to the ballot, probably.
well, and this is totally agree with you there. This is kind of the thing I wanted to get to also, that I think is just going back to that tribalism, unfortunately, because the biggest thing when I had conversations usually with the Democratic or more liberal leaning people that start kind of connect like, oh, you mean this would give Tesla more competition? And I was like,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
there'd
a
be more EV.
growing issue.
And so instead of like the incentive like of either being more jobs or more clean energy or more EVs, it was just like, oh, we can kind of stick a deal on. And that to me is kind of the tribalism that I find so frustrating personally. And I'm trying to really find like, and I think this is why it's so important to usually take it uh, to actual voters, like open this up to make it more competitive and give options to everyone, give it to the consumer. But I know you recently had kind of done a poll that got a lot of media headlines
Yeah, we did.
around kind of the political affiliation and this kind of unfortunately, I think has had pro and negative EV connotations around pulling of Elon Musk and how this all breaks into it. And I think it'd be kind of just fascinating if you wanted to maybe share a little bit about
Sure,
that.
sure. Well, when we started our pod here, I talked about that national poll we did in November of 2023. Well, we did it again after the election.
Yeah.
A few new questions, but we wanted to track movement, and our goal is to do it every year. It's kind of a state of EV polarization poll. So we asked an Elon question, and the Elon stuff was so fun and telling, both Elon and Tesla's brand, that we spun it out as a separate report. And I see you're putting it up, which is great. You can also get it at evpolitics.org.
Yeah,
You
I'll
just
have a link to this because it is really. I
Okay,
mean, as
yeah,
you
you
can
can
see, I don't
download the
want this
whole
to
thing.
be a whole thing about Elon Musk and all that stuff, but
Yeah.
it was just really fascinating. And
Well, he's
this,
super polarizing. I mean, he was a year
exactly
ago, but nothing like now. So here's on the chart here. If you're a Trump voter, and this is after the election, you're 74% favorable Elon, 10% unfavorable, 7-to-1 ratio, which is really good. Those are close to Trump's own numbers. He's only a
right,
step
right,
behind Trump. On the other hand, if you're a Harris voter, you give Elon a 76% negative rating and a 5% positive rating, which makes me laugh because the margin of error on the poll is 4%. So we can't statistically prove that any Harris voters who like Elon exist in the
right, right.
continental and connected United States. So anyway, massively polarizing. And then we broke it out by different groups. And if we take a look at that, Elon is more popular with people who drive ICE cars than he is with EV drivers. As you can see, it's 35-42. So he's 7 points underwater with EV drivers. Well, he's plus 5 points with ICE car drivers, which is kind of amazing. If you're a male, he's doing pretty well. Generally, in politics, you want to see a 3-to-1 ratio. So none of these numbers are particularly great. But
Yeah,
he's 49
that's
over 30
interesting.
with men, but he's underwater by 9 points with women. Big gender gap. And then finally, if you drive a pickup truck, and part of this is the Republican Democrat rural urban thing, expressed through cars, you like Elon, you're 46 over 28. They're his best numbers.
Right, which I thought was probably the funniest metric of all this.
Oh,
And
no, the whole thing is through the looking glass here.
yeah. And
The
this whole
Yeah,
40, I mean, it's 40 pages, and obviously it's not just about this. It covers a lot of the different things looking at,
right.
like
The
this
the
slide does
brand number
Tesla.
is interesting, I think. If you go
Yeah.
up to the considering, so we asked people to put themselves in one of three categories. Category one was, excuse me. The
No
first
worries.
category was, and we read them statements and said, which one sounds like you? First statement was, I'm pretty seriously interested in buying an EV in the next year or so. The second statement was, I'm interested in buying an EV, but I'm waiting till prices come down and they get all the bugs worked out, which is charging basically. And the
Yeah.
third statement is, I'm probably never going to buy an EV. So 20% were in the first category. If I'm pretty seriously interested in a year or two. And among those people, we asked some car brands. And if you keep going, you come down, you'll see Toyota,
Oh,
Volkswagen, and Ford. We always tend on these ask one American, one German, one Asian brand. And among Toyota was the most popular, by the way, among Toyota, Ford, and I think it's down a little farther. Um, and VW, they were all more popular than Tesla as a brand among people seriously considering buying an EV in the next year or so. Tesla wasn't buried. They were like 60% favorable over 30 something unfavorable. But Toyota was 90-10. In fact, I presented this data
yeah.
or a version of this at SAE at their big Washington conference, about 500 auto people. And a couple of Toyota guys came up. Yeah. The slide you got up now is instructive. There's no partisan difference about most auto brands. With Tesla, there is now. And when you say electric only brand, there is. The Republicans instantly turn on it and get all negative. But with Toyota, among people looking at buying an EV at 90-10, these Toyota guys pulled, can I get a copy of the presentation? We could wake up the guys at headquarters. We could say, and we could make a decent EV for a change, because they all know the one they have is kind of a dog. We could
Yeah, I
we
mean,
could sell them. And
and
same with
for
Ford and
anyone
VW.
listening,
They
this
were
this
both
is in the
good.
link, so you can pull these up. And I mean, it's a super fascinating report. It's not just obviously a big part of it's like Elon Musk and Tesla, but it's really just interesting to see these different auto brands too. And you're totally right with Toyota. Their EV is at best like a compliance vehicle. But what's really interesting, I think, when we look back at like the past sales recently for a couple of quarters, Chevy's been growing, or GM
Yeah,
has
they're
been
over
growing.
100,000. Cadillac
Well,
in particular, but the
for sure.
Equinox, yeah,
But I think one of my favorite interesting things when you start looking at this, and it totally aligns to this, where you just have so many consumers, they're just tied to a certain automotive brand. This is why competition is great. But look at the Honda Prologue. It's actually not that
GM
amazing of an
vehicle, yeah,
EV in spec wise. It
yeah,
doesn't look half bad. But what's interesting is most Honda buyers do not realize that that is just really a rebadged GM vehicle. It's made in GM factories and all these things. But just because it's at the Honda dealership, it has the Honda badge,
right.
it's selling well.
Mhm.
And so I think there is just so much of this is like the brands do have to bring a product to market no matter what. I think in the case of Toyota, it needs to tune up the specs a little bit, but this goes exactly to your point, is that just like if you build it, they will come to an extent. It's just unfortunate with what Toyota has, but looking at Honda, like there's nothing really different or innovative. It's just there is now an option for Honda buyers who are very
Right,
also
and
uh,
if you
reliable buyers.
if you've got a strong dealer force like Toyota or GM or Ford or Honda, you can move a lot of units if you give them product. And
Yeah.
the Honda story, that is a strong dealer force, and they know how to sell cars, and that is a strong brand. We didn't test them on this survey, but we've seen them in other places. So it does show that like here's Volkswagen on the charts. I'm assuming people can watch this podcast on YouTube,
Yes. Yeah.
whatever, and see
Yeah.
all
If they're
this, right?
streaming on YouTube, and we'll have clips of this.
Right.
And like I said, for those listening, this is page 10 of this deck that is linked in the show notes for today.
But VW that doesn't test as well as Ford or Toyota, still 2-1 favor, unfavorable, but most importantly, no meaningful difference between Trump and Harris voters.
Right.
It's only the electric brands that are polarizing, and that's the Republicans going sideways. Now, there's one other finding here, though, about Elon. If you go near the end of this, down around 35 or so, you'll see a trend chart, and that's worth 2 minutes. Whoop, I'll go up a little. You just have it there. Look at 33, right here. So, up. Let's go down to. Sorry, audio listeners, but we're.
Yes.
So Oh, I'm sorry. I keep calling the wrong charts because I don't have it in front of me. If you go down one more, now we got it. Now we got it. We asked a kind of a telling question on the surveys. Do you agree or disagree with a series of statements? And one of them is EVs are for people that see the world differently than I do. And that gets right at the cultural differences, the tribalism. Among
Interesting. Yeah.
Republicans, a bit over a year ago in November of 2023, 59% agreed with that statement and only 41 disagreed. So, it was an 18-point deal. In the poll after the election, same question, it went from 59 agree among Republicans only to 52 agree. And disagree went from 41 to 48. So now instead of being, 18-point difference, it's only a 4-point difference. So
Which is
that has
wild. Yeah.
closed a lot. That, I think, is Elon, even without meaning to. In other words, he is such a EV identified guy, and he's such a super Trumper now. He could be softening that tribal thing. If Elon ever wanted to be Nixon to China and say real MAGA people drive EVs or fun to run over liberals
Yeah.
with, he would
Great
help.
reference. Yeah.
But right now, he's killing the Tesla brand. It is not a surprise they're having all these trouble and their sales numbers are going down. He is a real problem for them. And they're not getting the longer term upside of moving Republican numbers, though some of it is just happening organically, as this chart shows you. And it's still a problem. A majority of Republicans think EVs are for freaks who aren't like me. But it's not 60-40 anymore. It's now tied.
Yeah.
And that is progress. So, and we have some other questions.
That's
where we
only
think,
1 year. That's a massive change.
Yeah. Well, he's become, co-president and MAGA superstar. He's gone from EV Jesus to Hannity. But the Tesla's not getting, in the short term, the upside of that new image, but they're getting all the downside that people. I mean, there was a thing all over I think it was Sheryl Crow. She had
I saw that.
Yeah, it blew up on Instagram or wherever she posted it, TikTok, showing her waving goodbye to her Tesla as it's towed away.
And
And
then ironically, she bought a Land Rover. So, I mean, the optics to me was just like, okay, clearly it wasn't about the environment. The optics were the
no,
optics.
it's not about, so EVs are not about the environment. Let's put it this way.
Yeah.
To the extent EVs are about the environment, is being massively overpowered by the downside of the environment. And this is hard. I mean, I was in at the EDF and they're great and explain, and they kind of get it. My argument is, look, on the emission side, if you can get Bubba out of his pickup truck, you don't have to get him to put a Save the Whale sticker on.
Right,
It
right.
doesn't have to come to your meetings and bring a dream catcher and sing the Joan Baez song. I understand Republican culture. I've worked in it 40 years. I'm one of them. But if you can tell him he can go floor it in a drag race and in a Ford Lightning and accelerate beyond his irritating hippie neighbor in the Volvo, um, and he can carry stuff around, and you can plug a saw into it and 110 power. As long as you're not doing a lot of towing, you got a lot of attribute arguments on that car.
Yeah.
Anyway, so looking at this is the one I talked about. If you're looking to buy an EV in the next year or so, or you're seriously interested, that 20%, Ford 3-1, good numbers. They need product, but good numbers. 76-24. Volkswagen 73-23. Toyota 94-6.
Wow.
And I have a feeling that's been sent up to Toyota City by those folks at the SAE conference. And then Tesla 63-37. Not terrible, but nothing like the competition. And again, you got 37%, so a third of people thinking about an EV in the next year, ruling out Tesla. Now, the attributes may still slide them into one. The market's going to be
Yeah.
flooded with cheap Teslas coming off lease. So that
And
may
and this
be
is something actually I wanted to
full,
ask
but
you about this
yeah,
is I have heard so many people say, "Oh, I'm never going to buy another EV. I'm never going to buy another Tesla because Elon Musk, yada yada yada." They've been saying this for a couple of years. I know over 10 people I can just list right now that ended up getting into the Tesla. Now, a big part of that is the price.
right. Price
Um,
is always number one.
yeah. And so I am curious with one, I'm also curious if you're planning to poll these people in another year and see what they actually bought. But two, like, what do you think that conversation looks like at Tesla, like trying to change that narrative? Or I'm just kind of curious on what your thoughts of this is more looking
Yeah.
forward
Well,
and
if
what
I
you
were,
actually expect what people say versus what people do.
yeah, no, look, if you give them a great offer on price, and generally, I'm I'm happy about all these used Teslas coming into the lease market because it'll hit volume. The biggest concern about EVs is price and charging. So if
Yeah.
price starts getting fixed, you sell more EVs. You sell more EVs, more people have friends or relatives driving an EV, all the numbers go up. So flooding the market with used Teslas, even with Elon's problem, is a big net win. And that'll
Yeah.
be helpful for Tesla too. Again, people will say, I hate the guy, I love the car. Now, if you're Tesla's CMO, chief marketing officer right now, I think you're probably in a dark room with a bottle of whiskey and a revolver, just staring into space because they can't get rid of them, but they're paying a huge market tax by being part of Elon. And Elon, I'll tell you, as a political consultant, and there's a good story in the Washington Post today about the polling showing his skyrocketing unfavorable and Trump's unfavorable is raising because they've been off to a deliriously fun MAGA start, not a
Right.
very good entire electorate start. And the polling numbers are starting to show it. So play that forward a few months, go through the Trump Elon fight that I bet is coming, two tomcats inside one pillow sack. I don't think it'll last. Uh, I just saw a poll in California of voters connected to potential governor candidates, and Elon's unfavorable in California is pushing 60%. You ought to look at him in Northern California. So eventually, Tesla's going to be under pressure to promote Elon, the rocket genius and backup power and robot guy, and get him out of the car brand. Now, how they do that, because Elon has so much of the stock and everything, is tricky.
Right.
Though, if this trend continues and Tesla has another bad quarter or two, they're still number one in market share, but it's slipping. You can start seeing shareholder trouble. The shareholder kind of lawsuit world saying he's destroying the value of the brand. And that
Yeah, I
would be
mean,
a
and
big
this isn't an investment channel by any means, but it is really interesting just because they are kind of one of the original meme stocks and all that stuff, if you will, because they have
Yeah.
such a outsized, large retail investor base. And you're totally right. Like that could, as if that starts to slide. But I guess one thing I wanted to take a step back to share another anecdote is leading up to this recent election. I kind of I wasn't really paying that close attention, but just kind of like, as they say, the vibes. I thought Trump pretty much had in the bag the whole time. And I wouldn't even say, I live on the West Coast. I don't live in a liberal or a conservative area. I live in rural areas, but they're still pretty liberal. And I still kind of thought he had, because I would just see Trump signs in parts of these towns where like, that never happened. And then it was like 48 hours before the election. I was going to hang out with my in-laws more. I was seeing like CNN and some of these other things. And I was like, oh, maybe Kamala's going to win. And it was because of all these polls, all this
Well, it
stuff.
was close
And
in the popular vote,
it,
but it
it
was,
was, but like the narrative and the polls were pretty far off from the level of the execution. And I think a lot of the data you're sharing, the point you done, is actually pretty accurate and really relevant. I'm kind
well,
of curious what you do and like how do you find the signal versus the noise, as they say,
well, there are a
especially in
lot of ways.
something
I
this
mean, I
big.
was wrong. I had very little certitude, but I thought she had a bit of an edge going in. Though I will tell you, EVs were a big part of how Trump won. And we did
Hmm.
a study on
That's
this. You
true.
can get it on the
Interesting.
website on Michigan, because we went to the Harris campaign and the super PACs and screamed, you got to make it a jobs issue in Michigan. I've done a lot of campaigns in my home state. I did 3 governor races that won there, hold the record for that among Republicans, winning Senate races. I know that state very well. You don't want to be on the wrong side. It's pretty obvious. Of the auto industry, there are 50,000 new EV manufacturing and tech jobs in Michigan, and nobody
Right.
knows about it. So I said, make them famous because Trump's coming for EVs. Well, Trump spent, and the Republican Party, because there was a Senate race where EVs were a huge issue. This is really only true of Michigan. $30 million beating the hell out of EVs. Your job's going to go, uh, Biden mandates, all that stuff. The Harris campaign spent exactly $1 fighting back on it. The Slotkin, the Democratic Senate candidate, did fight back. She put up an ad that mimicked an ad we
Yeah, I
ran,
did see that.
saying that you want the jobs in China or here. And she
Right.
narrowly won. And we actually, and you can download the report. It has, you can see the ads, you can see our polling we did 2 weeks out to see how bad the damage was. And it shows in the automotive manufacturing counties, she ran significantly ahead of Harris, enough to win, while Harris lost. 2 weeks before the election, we did a poll because I wanted to see how bad the damage was. And it was bad. And that's all in the report. Michigan people were 60-40 saying that EVs are bad for Michigan. They've been totally convinced by the Trump advertising campaign. Among people who get their living from either automotive or manufacturing in Michigan, which are connected, which is 1 out of 4 voters, Trump was winning them by double digits. So,
Right.
you know,
And
the
as just an
Harris
aside, I will
campaign
always,
blew the EV issue in
yeah,
the
that's, and
state where it counted the most. And
that's a great point, actually.
yeah.
I talk, and I believe John McElroy a little bit about this, but I think kind of like retrospective, that's something that should have gotten more attention, especially for that state. And you're right, that kind of
Yeah, and
dynamic
it's a winning
between,
thing. We tested, we when we made an ad, and we didn't have the funding, and we're not in the campaign business, but we made a
yeah,
nonpartisan ad that said EVs are good for Michigan, 50,000. You can see it on the AmericanEVjobs.org website. And we ran it digitally, and we got about 1 million impressions into auto swing voters. And we did it early to protect the category, to try to make EVs not bashable in the election. But frankly, we couldn't raise the funding to run it at the level that it really needed, and then 30 million on the other side. That was
yeah,
the end of that. But we tested that ad. We did an online test with a whole bunch of voters, and even Trump voters that raised their EV thing 12 points. So we have a story to tell on jobs. We've done Republican only polling that proves it. We're going to be releasing that soon. But we got to engage. So one thing we're very focused on now is we're going to have the website up pretty soon, where there are 35 districts, congressional districts, that have gotten $167 billion of EV investment and
wow,
200,000 new jobs. Thank you to Atlas Policy for doing the hard work to figure all that out. So those 35 districts, 7 are Democrat, 28 are Republican. So we're targeting voters in those districts. We're texting them. We say, hey, you got 180 jobs right here in Murphyville. Click here to protect them. Then you go to a website and you push a button, your congressman gets an email or a postcard. So we're about to launch that effort in about 10 days. Because if we make it a jobs fight, we do a lot better. If we
For
make
sure.
it a Biden green car fight, we're going to lose. And right now it's a Biden green car fight.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I guess just as an aside, as I was going to say earlier, looking back at the presidential election, I think that call out of what happened in Michigan and that divide is really fascinating. And like inherently, Kamala Harris, I don't think any politician in modern times had a more difficult thing than you have 100 days, you have to become president.
Right.
Campaign that you would have to run. So I kind of
No,
applaud
it
them
was
for
tough,
like
but they should
taking
have
on
had a
Mission
process.
Impossible.
They
Oh,
shouldn't
totally.
have
There's
nominated
so
her with
many
a
things
conference
on
call.
both
Carville
sides
and
that I'm
I,
just like, how the hell did
yeah,
this happen?
talk
I'm a
about
pretty
this a
down the
lot.
middle centrist kind of guy,
Yeah.
but
No, she had to
just such
beat
a
somebody
fascinating
to be
election.
somebody. So
Yeah.
they should have had a 2-week primary thing. And the
Yeah.
stronger candidate might
I
have
completely agree
emerged.
with the primary. Yeah.
Yeah, but instead they coronated her, and then that was that. So I'll finish up by saying this fight is not only important for American jobs and the future of EVs. You can't underestimate how important the subsidies are. When the Germans cut their consumer
Yeah, that was
subsidies,
a
they
pretty
had
big
a
drop off.
27% drop in sales. If that $7,500 lease credit goes away, it's going to have a devastating short-term effect on EV sales. The used market will still be pretty powerful because the pricing is lower, but new cars, particularly, where the bulk of the sales are, 50K and up, are going to get hit really hard, and automakers are going to back off because there's
Well,
a
you bring
limit
up
to
a
how much,
really good point too about leasing specifically.
Yeah,
That gets access to that, and that's why there are so many cheap EV leases right now, is leveraging that. And so I think
right.
there are a few automakers specifically who aren't, they're selling some, but vast majority of their vehicles are leases. And you're right, it's not going to be so much that the product change or like sales will change. It's because leases are so much of EV
They're more
sales
than
and
half
EVs
of
on the
new
road.
EV sales are
And for
financed
some
by
brands,
leasing.
it's closer to 75% right
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
But Mike, I realize we've gone out over time. This has been a
Well, it was fun.
super fascinating, great conversation. And my apologies again for this, but I really want to have you guys back on soon with some of these things you've been
Sure.
teasing. But yes, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll have to talk again soon.
Well, Chase, I'll finish with a thank you. And we have a merch store. We don't make any money. We lose money on it, but I like people wearing the hats, American EV
For
Jobs
sure.
Alliance. We have all kinds of crazy stuff. Just go to evpolitics.org. And when you check out, if you enter the secret phrase, one word, no space, grid connections, 20%
Oh,
off. So there you go, just for your listeners.
well, thank you so much, Mike. I hope our listeners do take advantage of that. But yes, you'll find links to all this in today's show notes. And thanks again for coming on on today, and we'll have to have you again soon.
Thank you, pal.
We hope Mike Murphy and EV Politics Project's insights on EV politics, consumer attitudes, and the policies driving electric vehicle adoption have sparked new ideas and conversations. If you found this discussion valuable, please share this episode with at least one friend or colleague who might enjoy it as well. And please consider leaving us a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps more curious listeners find us. Also, stay connected with us by subscribing to our new newsletter using the link in the show notes. You'll receive the latest EV news, industry analysis, and policy updates straight to your inbox, so you're always in the loop. Thanks again for being part of the Grid Connections community. Until next time, this is the Grid Connections podcast signing off.